What is the worst thing to find inside a house you bought and paid for completely? A burglar, a fire, no. It is the parasite living off you, pushing a rent bill across the table and claiming ownership. My arrogant son-in-law did exactly that on a Friday evening. He had no idea the single file locked inside my desk drawer would wipe that smug smile off his face and destroy his entire life in less than 60 seconds. Hello everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Willow Mendez. I am 44 years old, and I make my living as a senior risk analyst for Etheria Dynamics, one of the most ruthless tech conglomerates in the country. My sanctuary is a sprawling, secluded estate nestled deep within Pinecrest Valley, Colorado. I bought it, paid for it in full, and the deed locked in a fireproof safe bears my name alone. With its heavy timber beams, towering stone fireplaces, and acres of private pine forest, it was meant to be a quiet retreat, a place to heal after my husband passed away a few years ago. When he died, he left behind his daughter Clara. She is 25 now. Even though I did not give birth to her, I love her with every ounce of my being. She is my child in every way that truly matters, a gentle soul who unfortunately lacks the cynical edge required to survive in this world. So when Clara married Julian, I wanted to give them a head start. The modern economy is brutal, and young couples struggle just to keep their heads above water. I opened my home, offering them the entire second floor of my house so they could save up to buy a place of their own. It seemed like a logical, compassionate choice to protect my family. At first, Julian played the part of the incredibly grateful son-in-law flawlessly. During those first few months, he was eager to please, practically tripping over himself to show his appreciation. He would spend his Saturday mornings mowing the vast lawns without being asked. If a pipe leaked beneath the kitchen sink, he was underneath it with a wrench before I could even pick up the phone to call a plumber. He even insisted on chipping in a modest percentage of the utility bills each month. "It is the least I can do, Willow. We are so incredibly thankful for this opportunity," he used to tell me, flashing a humble, boyish smile. But my role at Etheria Dynamics is not a comfortable desk job. I am constantly deployed across the country to assess corporate vulnerabilities, meaning I am out of town for weeks at a time. The house, for all intents and purposes, was left in their hands while I chased flights and lived out of sterile hotel rooms. That prolonged absence was the exact fertilizer Julian needed for his deep-seated delusions to bloom. Unchecked and unsupervised, he began to morph. The gratitude faded, replaced by a bizarre, inflated sense of ownership. He began to view himself not as a temporary guest saving money, but as the patriarch, the man of the house, the sole provider. It started with small, insidious oversteps that tested the waters of my authority. I returned home late one evening from a grueling 14-day trip, exhausted to my bones, only to find my security gate code had been changed. I was locked out of my own property in the freezing Colorado rain. When I finally reached him on his cell phone, he brushed it off casually. "I upgraded the security protocol today. I forgot to text you the new numbers," he said, his tone dripping with the nonchalance of a landlord speaking to a forgetful tenant. Then came the parties. I would come home to find the backyard littered with empty imported beer bottles and cigar ashes, the remnants of loud, boisterous gatherings he hosted while I was away. The final straw was the aesthetic takeover. He began purchasing obnoxiously expensive modern furniture pieces and arranging them in my main living room, completely displacing my carefully curated antique decor. He started throwing around phrases like "our estate" and "my property" whenever he invited his arrogant friends over. "Welcome to our home, guys," I heard him boast one evening from the top of the stairs, handing out glasses of my expensive scotch. "We have really put a lot of work into the place. The upkeep on a property this size is a massive responsibility, but I manage." Most people would have exploded in a fiery rage. Most homeowners would have marched down those stairs, demanded the house keys back, and thrown his expensive leather chairs out onto the driveway right then and there. But I am not most people. I am a senior risk analyst. My entire career is built on identifying threats, remaining completely detached from emotion, and systematically dismantling liabilities before they can cause catastrophic damage. When you confront a parasite too early, it simply digs its claws in deeper, plays the victim, and fights back. So I chose absolute silence. I took a deliberate step back into the shadows of my own home. I watched his ego inflate like a cheap balloon, observing his every move with cold, clinical precision. Every changed passcode, every arrogant comment, every unauthorized purchase became a crucial data point in my mental ledger. I smiled pleasantly over dinner, asked about his day, and then retreated to my locked study. I was not being passive. I was actively building a dossier. I was waiting for the perfect, undeniable moment to execute a flawless and devastating correction to the risk he posed. I had just returned from a brutal 21-day deployment in Seattle. My flights had been delayed for 6 consecutive hours, and my body felt as though it had been dragged across coarse gravel. All I wanted was a hot shower and the familiar, quiet comfort of my own mattress. I dragged my heavy luggage through the grand oak front doors, anticipating the silent sanctuary I so desperately needed. Instead, I was met with the harsh, glaring light of the crystal chandelier illuminating the main dining room. Julian stood at the threshold of the hallway, wearing a crisp, designer button-down shirt, looking far too energized and smug for 8 o'clock on a Friday evening. He blocked my path to the staircase, folding his arms across his chest. He requested a formal family meeting. He did not ask, he instructed. I left my suitcase by the foyer and walked slowly into the dining area, the thick tension in the air pressing against my skin. The long mahogany table stretched out before me. It was a beautiful piece of furniture I had commissioned from a local artisan 10 years ago, designed to host warm Thanksgiving dinners and family celebrations. Now it was being repurposed as a stage for a hostile takeover. Julian had already taken his seat. He had not chosen one of the side chairs. He sat in the oversized leather armchair at the absolute head of the table, the position of authority that had undeniably belonged to me since the day my husband passed away. He leaned back casually, crossing his legs and resting one ankle on his knee. A patronizing half-smile danced on his lips, the kind of arrogant smirk reserved for a lenient boss dealing with a problematic, insubordinate employee. He looked entirely too comfortable basking in an artificial, self-appointed aura of absolute control. To his right sat Clara. My heart ached fiercely just looking at her. She was positioned defensively, her shoulders hunched inward as if she were trying to make herself physically invisible. Her eyes remained glued to the intricate patterns of the wood grain on the table. She was wringing her hands, her fingers weaving tightly together, her knuckles turning bone white under the terrible strain. I recognized that posture immediately. It was the tragic body language of a victim who had been methodically conditioned, emotionally worn down, and completely subjugated. The vibrant, independent young woman I raised was fading away, replaced by a terrified shadow tethered to the whims of a narcissist. She did not look up when I entered. She just swallowed hard, trapped entirely in the suffocating gravitational pull of his psychological manipulation. I took a seat near the middle of the table. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my expression entirely blank, letting the heavy silence stretch out and fill the room. I refused to prompt him. If he wanted this confrontation, he was going to have to initiate it himself. Without a hint of hesitation or the slightest shred of human decency, Julian reached into a sleek leather portfolio resting beside his elbow. He retrieved a single sheet of premium cardstock paper and slid it across the polished mahogany surface. The paper glided smoothly, coming to a halt precisely in front of me. I glanced down. It was formally typed, meticulously formatted into itemized financial columns. At the very top, it bore the bright red stamped emblem of his own interior design firm. The title, printed in bold, uncompromising letters, read, "Shared Living Space Invoice." I kept my breathing steady and measured. I looked from the absurd document up to his deeply satisfied face. He uncrossed his legs and leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on my table, interlacing his fingers in a textbook display of manufactured dominance. He cleared his throat and confidently launched into his prepared monologue. He calmly elaborated that the invoice was a formalized demand for my monthly rent. I looked down at the specific items. He was demanding $2,500 for my occupation of the ground floor master suite, and an additional $400 for the 2 bays I utilized in my own garage. He possessed the sheer audacity to articulate his twisted financial logic out loud, treating me as though I were completely ignorant. He stated that over the past 12 months he had personally funded upgrades to the lawn sprinkler system and purchased gallons of paint to coat the backyard fence. Furthermore, he claimed that his daily oversight and management of the property while I traveled for work constituted a massive investment of his personal labor. By his staggering delusional estimation, these minor maintenance tasks had firmly established a tangible equity stake in the real estate. He was no longer a guest. In his mind, he was a majority shareholder demanding a return on his investment from a minority partner. Clara whimpered softly, a tiny fractured sound of profound distress that she quickly stifled by biting her lower lip. Julian ignored his wife completely. His eyes were locked onto mine, shining with a terrifying blend of unchecked greed and absolute delusion. He leaned back again, returning to his relaxed, victorious posture. He offered one final mocking statement, throwing a direct challenge straight into my face. "It is only fair, Willow," he said, his voice dripping with heavy condescension. "You cannot just live for free in a house that I am pouring my sweat and hard work into maintaining." Julian had undoubtedly rehearsed this exact moment in his head 100 times. He was waiting for the explosion. He was bracing for my face to flush bright red, for me to slam my fists down on the mahogany table, or to scream at the top of my lungs about how ungrateful and delusional he was. He wanted a chaotic emotional outburst so he could play the calm, rational victim in front of my daughter. He got absolutely nothing. I did not blink. I did not shift my weight. I simply let my eyes fall upon the piece of paper, staring at the printed numbers with the hollow, lifeless gaze of a spectator forced to sit through an incredibly cheap and predictable theatrical performance. I let all the warmth drain from my expression until my face was a mask of cold, unreadable stone. The temperature in the grand dining room seemed to plummet instantly. I let the silence stretch. 1 second, 2 seconds. The heavy quiet became a physical weight pressing down on the space between us. 3 seconds, 4 seconds. Clara stopped breathing, her eyes darting nervously toward her husband. 5 seconds. 6 seconds. The manufactured, arrogant smile on Julian's face began to stiffen. The muscles in his jaw twitched. 7 agonizing seconds of absolute deathly silence ticked by, and I watched the subtle tremor begin in his fingers as he realized his carefully crafted script was disintegrating before his eyes. I moved with agonizing slowness. I placed my hands flat on the edge of the table and pushed myself up. The heavy wooden legs of my chair scraped violently against the polished oak floorboards. The harsh, high-pitched screech tore through the suffocating quiet, like a physical blade, causing Clara to flinch violently in her seat. I did not offer a single syllable of commentary. I did not even grant Julian the dignity of making eye contact as I turned my back on him. I walked out of the dining room with a smooth, unhurried gait, allowing my heels to click methodically against the hardwood. I moved down the long-shadowed corridor that led to the secluded corner of the house where I kept my private study. It was the one room in the entire estate that remained completely off-limits, secured behind a heavy steel core door. Back in the dining area, the silence was so profound that they could hear every mechanical action echoing down the hallway. They heard the distinct, sharp hum of the security panel waking up. Then came the rigid electronic tones of the keypad. Beep, 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 beep. Each solitary metallic sound cut through the air with surgical precision. To Julian, sitting at the head of my table, every single chime must have sounded like the steady, unforgiving ticks of a countdown clock marking the rapid end of his unchecked vanity. Exactly 1 minute later, I emerged from the shadows of the hallway and returned to the dining room. Julian had not moved an inch. He was staring at the doorway, his chest rising and falling a little too quickly. I approached the table with purposeful strides. I raised my right hand, grasping a remarkably thick black leather-bound portfolio. With a deliberate downward thrust, I slammed the heavy file directly onto the mahogany wood. It landed with a violent, deafening smack. The sheer weight of the leather portfolio completely eclipsed his ridiculous piece of paper, burying his pathetic demand for rent under a mountain of undeniable catastrophic truth. I crossed my arms tightly over my chest, planting my feet firmly on the hardwood floor. I did not say a single word. I simply tilted my chin downward, offering a sharp, authoritative nod toward the heavy black leather cover. I was issuing a silent command. "Open it." Julian swallowed hard, the sound loud in the dead quiet of the room. The exaggerated confidence that had radiated from him just a few minutes prior was evaporating rapidly, replaced by a creeping, suffocating uncertainty. He hesitated for a long moment, staring at the closed folder as if it were a live, explosive device. Slowly, he reached out. His fingers, which had been so steady and relaxed when he slid that laughable rent bill across my table, were now visibly trembling. He grasped the edge of the cover and flipped it open. He was likely expecting to see a standard property deed or a title certificate. Some basic administrative paperwork I had fetched to redundantly prove that I owned the physical structure of the house. He was bracing for a territorial dispute. He was entirely unprepared for a financial slaughter. The first page was not a real estate document. It was a dense, highly specialized legal contract printed on premium watermarked paper. At the top center, written in bold, unyielding typography, were the words "Commercial Debt Assignment and Purchase Agreement." The truth of his miserable situation was finally exposed under the harsh light of the dining room chandelier. 2 years ago, when Julian first decided he was going to conquer the luxury interior design market, he severely overestimated his own business acumen. He burned through his initial operating capital in less than 6 months. Desperate to keep up appearances, fund his failing venture, and maintain the facade of a successful entrepreneur, he turned to secondary lenders. He took out massive, high-risk commercial loans with predatory interest rates hovering around 25%. He was drowning in a sea of toxic debt, a fact he had meticulously hidden from everyone, especially my daughter. He thought he was outsmarting the system by shuffling the borrowed money around, robbing one lender to pay another. What he did not know was that I tracked distressed assets and corporate vulnerabilities for a living. When I discovered the sheer magnitude of his financial incompetence, I did not confront him. A confrontation would only lead to empty promises. Instead, I established a completely anonymous corporate shell entity registered in Delaware. Through that proxy firm, I systematically approached his desperate, aggressive lenders and bought up every single cent of his outstanding debt. Julian stared at the executed signature line at the bottom of the page. There, stamped in undeniable black ink alongside the seal of a notary, public was the legal transfer of rights. The document clearly certified that the Delaware Shell Company had subsequently dissolved and transferred all secured assets and debt ownership to a single private individual. That individual was Willow Mendez. I watched the exact second the reality of his situation violently crushed him. I was not just his mother-in-law. I was his sole exclusive creditor. I owned his commercial loans. I owned his business equipment. I owned the future revenue of his failing company. I held the absolute, uncontested power to instantly liquidate his entire professional and financial existence the very moment he missed a single payment. The woman he had just accused of being a freeloader, the woman he had just attempted to extort for living in her own home, was the only reason he had not already been dragged into bankruptcy court. The physical transformation was horrific and deeply satisfying to witness. The color drained from Julian's face so rapidly that his skin turned the sickly, ashen shade of wet concrete. The blood completely left his cheeks. His jaw dropped slightly, his lips parting as he tried to pull air into his suddenly restricted lungs. His eyes widened into vast white circles of pure, unadulterated terror. He looked up at me, his mouth opening and closing in rapid, pathetic stutters. He desperately tried to form a single coherent word to offer some kind of excuse or defense, but his vocal cords completely failed him. The psychological whiplash of plunging from the absolute peak of manufactured power to the absolute rock bottom of financial slavery had paralyzed him entirely. The heavy silence was broken by a soft rustle of paper. Clara, who had been frozen in her chair, tentatively leaned over her husband's shoulder. Her eyes scanned the dense legal jargon until she landed on the principal balance column. I had seen the exact amount earlier. It was a staggering $450,000. A strangled gasp escaped her throat. The grand illusion of her successful, dignified husband completely shattered right in front of her eyes. She realized in that agonizing instant that the man sitting beside her was not a strong provider. He was a fraud carrying a catastrophic burden of hidden debt, yet possessing the sheer delusional arrogance to demand rent from the woman who was secretly holding his entire world together. Clara buried her face in her hands, her shoulders violently shaking as she broke down into loud, heartbroken sobs, mourning the devastating death of the lie she had been living. I raised my right hand, extended my index finger, and struck my lacquered nail hard against the edge of the mahogany table. The sharp, singular sound cut straight through the heavy air and Clara's weeping. "Turn to page 4, Julian," I commanded. My voice was completely devoid of inflection, a flat, deadpan order that left zero room for negotiation. He flinched as if I had physically struck him across the face. His hands were shaking so violently now that he could barely grip the thick parchment. He fumbled with the top corners, flipping past pages 2 and 3, which contained the exhaustive, itemized schedules of his defaulted commercial loans. When he finally peeled back the third sheet to reveal page 4, the last remaining drops of blood drained entirely from his face, leaving behind a horrifying, sickly pallor. What lay before him was not another financial ledger. It was a comprehensive, highly classified risk assessment dossier formatted with the unmistakable, clinical precision of my private investigatory software. It was a flawless, undeniable map of his criminal activity. 6 months ago, my professional instincts had caught a faint, anomalous ripple in the financial ecosystem surrounding my estate. While Julian believed he was operating entirely under the radar, he had severely underestimated the level of surveillance I maintained over my own assets. In a desperate, pathetic bid to inject liquid cash into his failing interior design firm, he had crossed the line from a terrible businessman to a calculated felon. He had secretly utilized my home address, the very roof I had graciously put over his head, to file a series of massive fraudulent insurance claims. He had forged documents alleging severe structural water damage to the western wing of the estate, backed by completely fabricated contractor invoices and fake photographic evidence. He had attempted to siphon hundreds of thousands of dollars from the insurance underwriters, intending to launder the payout directly into his bankrupt company to cover his tracks. But he was an amateur playing in a field dominated by apex predators. Utilizing my extensive resources and forensic network access at Etheria Dynamics, I had intercepted the anomalous data packets the moment the first claim hit the preliminary processing queue. I did not alert the authorities immediately. Instead, I operated in complete stealth. I systematically froze the payout pipelines, effectively barricading my property title from any legal blowback, and then I spent the next several weeks quietly vacuuming up every single digital footprint he had clumsily left behind. The dossier in front of him contained absolutely everything. It held the IP addresses of the computers he used to submit the fake claims. It featured high-resolution printouts of the forged signatures he had applied to the damage reports. It included the routed bank account numbers he had set up to receive the stolen funds. It was a beautifully constructed, inescapable steel trap of criminal evidence. "If I take this specific folder and hand it over to the Economic Crimes Division of the State Police tomorrow morning," I said, my tone as casual as if I were discussing the local weather, "you will not merely be facing a humiliating personal bankruptcy. You will be indicted for multiple counts of wire fraud, identity theft, and organized insurance fraud. In this state, the mandatory minimum sentencing for the dollar amount you attempted to steal will guarantee you spend the next 10 to 15 years sitting in a federal penitentiary." Julian's entire body convulsed with a violent shudder. The psychological devastation was absolute. Heavy, cold sweat erupted across his forehead, gathering in thick drops that rolled down his pale cheeks and dripped onto his designer shirt collar. His chest heaved erratically, struggling to pull oxygen into lungs that felt entirely paralyzed. He was no longer looking at a mother-in-law he could easily bully and manipulate. He was staring directly at his own executioner. His wide, terrified eyes slowly drifted from the damning evidence on page 4 down to the miserable printed piece of paper he had so proudly slid across the table just 10 minutes earlier. The shared living space invoice, the demand for rent. Beside the towering, catastrophic reality of federal prison and total financial ruin, his little extortion attempt looked like the most absurd, laughable, and completely self-destructive piece of scrap paper in the history of the world. I watched the devastating epiphany finally detonate behind his eyes. The ultimate crushing irony of his situation became agonizingly clear to him in that exact second. I had possessed this apocalyptic information for half a year. I had kept the massive debt entirely hidden. I had buried the insurance fraud. I had locked it all away in my private study with the sole solitary intention of never ever using it. I was perfectly willing to eat the financial loss and keep his filthy secrets buried forever purely to protect Clara from the trauma and humiliation of discovering she had married a desperate criminal. I was going to let him pretend to be a success just to keep the peace in my family. But his own unchecked greed had ruined everything. His massive, fragile ego could not handle simply living for free. He had to push for dominance. He had to demand rent for a house he was secretly using to commit felonies. By sliding that arrogant invoice across my table, Julian had forced my hand. He had personally reached out and triggered the very time bomb I had spent 6 months trying to defuse. He had no one to blame but himself. He had engineered his own total destruction. The absolute magnitude of the trap he had blindly walked into finally shattered whatever remained of Julian's pathetic bravado. His legs simply gave out beneath him. He slid off the edge of the oversized leather armchair, his knees slamming into the oak floorboards with a heavy, hollow thud. He threw his arms forward, his hands frantically gripping the edge of the mahogany table. His knuckles turned stark white, no longer fueled by manufactured authority, but by pure, unadulterated desperation. "Willow, please, you have to listen to me," he stammered. His voice had completely lost its deep, patronizing resonance, cracking into a high-pitched, breathless whine. "The invoice, the rent thing, it was just a joke, a stupid, over-the-top joke. I never actually expected you to pay it. You know my sense of humor. We are family. You cannot do this to me." It was the ultimate coward's retreat. Faced with total annihilation, he tried to reduce his malicious extortion attempt into a harmless prank. I did not pull away from him. I leaned forward, resting my hands firmly on the table, bringing my face down until I was merely inches away from his sweating, trembling face. I looked directly into his bloodshot, terrified eyes. My voice was not loud. It did not carry an ounce of anger. It was cold, flat, and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. "Maturity is not measured by trying to project power over others," I told him, enunciating every single syllable with glacial precision. "It is measured by knowing exactly where your place is, and you have forgotten yours." I straightened my posture, towering over his kneeling form, and delivered the final, non-negotiable ultimatum. "You have exactly 24 hours to pack your personal belongings and remove yourself from my property." I stated the finality of my words ringing through the cavernous dining room. "By this time tomorrow evening, if I so much as see a single pair of your shoes left in my hallway, I will have you physically removed by private security. Next week, my corporate proxy will officially initiate the aggressive liquidation of your interior design firm. I am calling in every single cent of your debt. And if you even entertain the fleeting thought of retaliation if you try to drag this family through a messy, prolonged divorce court to get at my assets, that fraud dossier goes straight to the district attorney. You will walk out of this house with nothing, or you will walk into a federal prison cell. That is your only choice." The silence that followed was broken by a sudden, decisive movement. Clara stood up. The soft, heartbroken weeping that had consumed her for the past 10 minutes had stopped entirely. The paralyzing confusion in her eyes was gone, replaced by a devastating clarity. the ironclad proof of her husband's deceit, his financial ruin, and his fundamentally rotten nature had finally broken the psychological hold he had over her. She looked down at the man groveling on the floor, seeing him not as her protector, but as a pathetic parasite. She reached across with her right hand and forcefully twisted the diamond wedding ring off her left finger. She threw it. The heavy metal band hit the polished mahogany table, spinning and rattling violently until it came to a dead stop right next to the damning black leather portfolio. "Get out," Clara whispered. Her voice was shaking, but it was anchored by a brand new, undeniable core of steel. She pointed a trembling finger straight toward the front entryway. "Get out of this house, and get out of my life, immediately." The following morning, the brilliant Colorado sun rose over the eastern ridge of Pinecrest Valley, flooding the vast estate with warm, golden light. The suffocating toxic energy that had plagued my home for months had been entirely eradicated. The heavy timber beams and stone fireplaces seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The house had returned to its original peaceful state. Down in the kitchen, tucked neatly away at the absolute bottom of the stainless steel trash can, Julian's ridiculous, arrogant demand for rent lay torn into a dozen jagged, unrecognizable pieces. I stood alone on the back patio, the crisp mountain air filling my lungs as I took a slow, measured sip of black coffee. I looked out over the endless expanse of towering pine trees, a profound sense of closure washing over me. I realized a harsh, uncompromising truth about the modern world. Unconditional kindness is a beautiful concept. But sometimes it is the exact poison that feeds betrayal and breeds unchecked entitlement. The only way to truly protect the people you love and the sanctuary you have built is knowing exactly when to be absolutely, unapologetically ruthless. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support James' revenge stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.